morning, Mr. Commissioner. This is the continuation of the Aboriginal fishing hearings. It's the final panel for that section of the hearings. On this panel, we have two witnesses. On my left is Karina McGivney, and on my right is Julie Stewart, both from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. I'll just start with a few brief questions to introduce them to you after they've been sworn.
You solemnly affirm that the evidence to be given by you to this hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
I do.
Would you state your name, please?
Karina McGivney.
Thank you.
Julie Stewart.
Thank you. Counsel?
Thank you. Could we have Exhibit 30, or our tab 33, please? Should be the CV of Ms. McGivney. Ms. McGivney, you're presently the director of the Salmonid Enhancement Program,
Yes, I am.
and that's in the Ecosystems Management Branch.
Yes, I am.
Sorry, you're going to have to turn on your microphone when you're speaking.
Sorry.
Thank you.
For the record, she answered in the affirmative to the last couple of questions. You joined the Department of Fisheries and Oceans initially in 1985,
Yes, I did.
and with the exception of a brief period with Indian and Northern Affairs, you've been continuously with the department since that time.
Yes.
Prior to holding your present position, you held a number of positions in the Treaty and Aboriginal Policy Directorate,
Yes, I did.
most recently as the Director of the Treaty and Aboriginal Policy Directorate,
Yes.
and you concluded that position in August of 2010.
Yes.
That can be marked as the next exhibit, please. We can have tab 34 on the screen, please.
That's Exhibit 1418.
The document on the screen now, is that the position description for the position you held as Director of the Aboriginal Treaty and Aboriginal Policy Directorate?
Yes, it's the description.
Thanks. Could that be the next exhibit, please?
Exhibit 1419.
We could please have our tab 56 on the screen, which should be Ms. Stewart's CV. Ms. Stewart, you hold a law degree from the University of Victoria, which you obtained in 1988.
Yes.
You were called to the Bar of Ontario in 1990.
Yes.
You joined the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in 1992.
Yes.
Your present position is as Director of the Pacific Integrated Commercial Fishery Initiative, sometimes called PICFI,
Yes.
and that position is situated in Ottawa, is that correct?
Yes.
Ms. Stewart's CV could be the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit number 1420.
I'm going to start by asking the panel some questions about access and allocation and food, social, and ceremonial matters related to food, social, and ceremonial fishing. And I'm going to direct my questions to you, Ms. McGivney, initially. Does the department have a policy to provide priority access to First Nations to Fraser sockeye for food, social, and ceremonial purposes?
Yes, it does.
Does the department have a definition for food, social, and ceremonial, an operating definition?
There's no specific, there's the definition for food, social, ceremonial that the department works within is providing fish for those purposes. For domestic use, it's not to be sold.
Does the department have anywhere articulated in any of its policy documents the meaning of the word social or the word ceremonial?
No, it hasn't.
If there's no clear definition articulated, how are your resource managers supposed to set about negotiating numbers that provide for those purposes?
Our resource managers are negotiating access arrangements for food, social, ceremonial purposes, and through those negotiations they consider a variety of factors, and the First Nations bring forward their interests in these regards.
When resource managers enter into negotiations, they go in with a mandate provided to them,
Yes, they do.
and that mandate includes a number.
Yes, it does.
And is that number provided from Ottawa, or is it developed in the region?
Initially, prior to 2007, those mandates were developed approved in Ottawa. Since 2007, the individual specific mandates for the individual First Nations are determined by the RDG in Pacific Region.
Now, you've said that these numbers are arrived at through a negotiation. That's a negotiation with the First Nations group, correct?
the agreement, the numbers agreed to in the agreements are arrived at through negotiations.
So the food social ceremonial allocation, is it in part the product of the strength or skill with which the negotiation was handled by the First Nation?
It's a result of the negotiation, and there's certainly the DFO managers are going in with a mandate within which they can work, and they work with the First Nation to come to an agreed number.
You told me that there were a number of factors that were considered in coming up with an appropriate food social ceremonial allocation for any particular group. I wonder if you could explain to the Commissioner what those factors are.
The factors that are considered, there's a range of factors considered in terms of coming up with the food social ceremonial allocations. Some of those factors are the population, looking at the fish resources that are available to those First Nations, looking at how those fish resources, the status of those fish resources, the breadth of the different species that are available, what recent harvests have been of those species, looking at the including interests expressed by the First Nation with regards to the various species, the availability and access of other First Nations to those same species. So there's a broad range of factors that come into play in terms of determining the allocations.
Thank you. Does the department also consider what a reasonable food need would be for the population that's being provided for?
Identifying a need is a challenge. A food social ceremonial need is a challenge. First Nations themselves often have not come forward with quantifying that need. What we do is negotiate towards access for food social ceremonial purposes and coming up with an allocation that would provide for that.
Is it the department's intention that the number provided for food social ceremonial access in the communal license is a genuine reflection of what is actually needed for food social and ceremonial purposes?
As best as we can, we are working towards coming up with a number for access for the food social ceremonial. We look at a number of factors and as best as we can come up with something that would provide for that access and address those interests.
One of the factors you mentioned that is considered in arriving at numbers for food social and ceremonial access is previous harvest. Do I take it from that that there's an assessment done of previous harvest as one of the indicators of what the need might be?
The previous harvest is one of the factors considered in coming up with those and reflects the interests and the access by the First Nation to that stock and species, and so reflects some of that interest in terms of food social ceremonial purposes.
When the department is considering previous harvest as one of the factors, does it take into account any information that might suggest that some of the previous harvest may have been sold rather than used for food purposes or domestic purposes?
Whether those, are you referring to those allocations that might have been under economic opportunities?
No, I'm referring to those fish that may have been harvested pursuant to a license affording access for FSC purposes.
So we look at what's been harvested for food social ceremonial purposes. Food social ceremonial fish are not meant to be sold. So I'm struggling a little bit with your question.
Do I take it from your answer that there's no consideration or exploration done when looking at previous harvests as one of the factors as to whether or not any of the FSC fish may have been sold?
If we have evidence that they were sold, then I believe the department, there would be action taken. If we have evidence in that regard, it would be considered.
In your position as the director of the Treaty and Aboriginal Policy Directorate, did you receive information from Conservation and Protection that suggested that fish caught pursuant to FSC licenses by some bands may have been sold?
There are some specific circumstances that were brought to my attention.
And did you take that into account when applying the previous harvest factor to develop numbers for FSC access or FSC negotiations?
That's one of the considerations in our guidelines for looking at what allocations, how allocations might be negotiated. So that is one of the things that could be considered when we have that information.
In the time that you held your position, did the department take the position that any allocations should be reduced on the basis of evidence that previous harvest had been sold?
No, not that I recall.
In taking into account as one of the factors previous harvest, has the department considered the possibility that this sort of analysis might serve as an incentive for some First Nations to increase their harvest in order to create a pattern of higher harvest?
Is the question that by increasing their harvest that would provide a basis for a higher allocation in the future?
Yes.
That's a possibility in terms of how the First Nations might be approaching it. What we are looking at is what that actual harvest is, and that is being reflective of their food social ceremonial use.
We have exhibit 1189, please. The document which I'm having brought up on the screen, Ms. McGivney, is the First Nations Fisheries Action Plan, prepared in part, I think, by the First Nations Leadership Council. Is that a document you're familiar with?
Yes, I am.
Could you give me the page number one more time, please?
Certainly. 23, the document page.
Thank you.
And just for anyone else who's looking for it, is at tab 18 of our documents. And this is the page which sets out some of the action items set out in this plan. If you look at the second arrow on the left, that action item is increase food, social, and ceremonial use to increase baseline calculations used by governments in developing their mandates. Is that an action or a direction that you were familiar with?
I recall it being one of the points in the First Nations panel action plan.
We talked a minute ago about ceremonial. Are you able to, ceremonial use and social use, are you able to articulate any working definition for the commissioner of either of those two words?
I guess from the ceremonial perspective, that some of the items that might be coming forward from a social or ceremonial perspective are weddings or funerals or births and celebrations around those events. First Nations have a culture of celebrating and utilizing fish in those celebrations. And so there's an interest in that in us in terms of the departmental approach to coming up with allocations. We are working towards negotiating with First Nations an overall number for food, social, ceremonial that then they can manage that full use within these various interests, different purposes within the food, social, ceremonial, that they would manage that overall allocation to meet that broad need.
And social, can you similarly give some examples?
Social is a little bit more difficult, but some of the social events that First Nations might hold, we don't have a clear definition of that.
Okay. Are you aware that there's been some confusion amongst resource managers or looking for assistance from upper management as to how to apply those two terms when developing mandates or issuing licenses?
Yes, and that's part of the reason why we've been moving towards trying to work with coming up with one overall allocation that addresses those food, social, and ceremonial uses, so that First Nations themselves can decide amongst themselves how they want to kind of apportion that.
We could have our tab 39, please. This is an email from you to Diane Traeger, and it encloses an email from Heather James in the resource management portion of the department. And I'm just going to read the first sort of substantive paragraph of her email. Near the bottom of the page, DFO area staff are concerned about escalating levels of ceremonial catch in the Lower Fraser. There is a growing number of requests to fish for ceremonial purposes during the week. when there is communal fishing during the weekend. There are no guidelines on what should be considered appropriate criteria circumstances for ceremonial harvest. And then you, in your email to Diane Traeger, say, are you coordinating a process to address this issue? Was there a process to address that issue of confusion, and if so, what was the outcome from that process?
I can't recall the specific process, but my recollection is that the outcome is that what we were trying to achieve was that the First Nations to be coordinating the food social ceremonial access as one unit, and that First Nations would work within that allocation and plan for their various food, social, and ceremonial, what components of the harvest would go to those different elements.
Did the process that was undertaken result in any sort of policy direction to resource managers to assist them in applying these terms?
Not that I can recall, other than that direction that we should be working towards just one allocation that First Nations could then plan for within that.
If that could be the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit 1421.
One of the other factors which you listed for the commissioner was was population. Does the department make an effort to obtain an equal or balanced allocation as between First Nations based in part on population?
Population is one of the factors that are considered, but it's not the only factor. And so therefore, because there's different populations, but there's different many of the other factors are also different between First Nations, that we're not applying per capita, if that's what you're suggesting.
Other factors being genuinely equal, so First Nations situated in similar regions in the province with similar access to other resources. In a situation like that, does the department attempt to have a balanced or equitable allocation?
The allocations are determined through the negotiations with the First Nations, and First Nations may have expressed different interests, may have different access to different species or different situations in their communities, and so therefore there is variability within that.
Thank you. Could we have our tab 45, please? Now, there's actually a letter included in this tab, and I don't propose to mark the Department of Justice's correspondence. This is a chart that you've seen before, Ms. McGivney?
Yes.
Mr. Commissioner, there's been some, on a couple of occasions, issues arisen with respect to banned populations. Mr. Eidsvik entered a document at some point, but its origin was somewhat uncertain. So I'm proposing to have this document marked. It was provided by candidates with their correspondence of March 8th. I'm just being told that this may actually be in Exhibit 1221. We've just determined. Can we pull out 1221, please, Mr. Lunn, and make sure it's the same document?
Yes, and we're just confirming here that it's been marked as well.
Thank you. And Ms. McGivney, just for the Commissioner's benefit, this is a chart of population data of Indian Act bands that receive licenses and allocations to harvest Fraser sockeye salmon, and the data in the chart was obtained from the band registry maintained by Indian and Northern Affairs.
Yes.
We've taken a quick look at these numbers and at some of the allocations, and there seems to be, sort of at a cursory look, some wide disparity between bands who, at first glance, appear to be similarly situated. In the lower Fraser, ranging from sort of, if we just do a per capita analysis, and except there's a number of variables, but just looking at that for a second, ranging from some situations where it's 5 per capita, 5 fish per capita, and others where there's over 60 sockeye allocated. And in the upper Fraser, we see as little as 5 or even less than that sometimes, and in other cases as many, numbers exceeding 100 fish per capita. I wonder if you can explain what the rationale might be for such a wide disparity in the FSC access that's allocated pursuant to communal licenses.
So as I indicated earlier, there's a number of factors. For instance, Fraser sockeye are not the only fish harvested by some of these groups. Some of these groups may have a variety of other species available to them, other species of salmon, other species of non-salmon. And so the interest in the groups with regards to Fraser sockeye, the overall allocations might vary between different stocks and species. Also, different groups have different interests. There's groups have access to different kinds of resources, might have different needs in terms of access to other species besides fish, in terms of food needs, etc. So there's a variety of factors that come into play.
From the department's perspective, and I'm not asking you to tell us what the state of the law is, but I'm asking you to tell us what the department's operating assumption is moving forward. Is it the case that the department operates on the assumption that First Nations in this province, at least in the Fraser watershed, have the right to access Fraser sockeye for food, social, and ceremonial purposes?
The department has taken a policy approach to providing food, social, ceremonial access, and that policy approach was based on looking at the main elements of the sort of having some historic fishing practices. It originally, with when the AFS program was introduced, negotiations were conducted with groups where there was some of that, but within the AFS agreements, it's very clear that both the First Nations and the department, there's a line that indicates this is not an acknowledgement or not an acknowledgement or not an acknowledgement of the rights. So it doesn't implicate, provide any direction whether these are rights or not.
Is the department's approach to providing economic access with respect to First Nations to not do so on a priority basis unless a right has been proven in court?
Yes.
I'm going to turn now to some questions related to the PIC fee program. And some of those will be for you, Ms. Stewart, and Ms. McGivney. I would invite you also to weigh in on some, because obviously you have. Ms. Stewart, through PIC fee, is the department intending or attempting to increase the number of sockeye, Fraser sockeye, caught in terminal or near terminal areas in the Fraser River?
Yes, and I wouldn't restrict it to sockeye, it would be all salmon.
Thank you. You might not be restricted to sockeye, sometimes we are. Why is the department making efforts in that regard?
To have commercial catches at terminals of the fishery is in aid of some of our policies around conservation, such as the wild salmon policy. It's one method of moving towards a more improving our ability to have fisheries that are not unduly impacting on weak stocks of salmon. You can target better with a terminal-based fishery.
Are there any other goals that the department is hoping to achieve by transferring allocations to in-river First Nations for commercial catching?
It also gives inland First Nations some opportunities to have an economically based salmon fishery that have previously not been available to them, but have been available to coastal First Nations.
Does the department have in mind a percentage of the commercial fishery that they intend to move from the marine and approach areas into the river, if we're talking about Fraser sockeye?
The PIC fee initiative we have within the PIC fee initiative an intention of using the available resources for relinquishment of licenses, the majority of which, in the case of salmon, would be for those inland fisheries. But it's important to keep in context that coastal First Nations have more access to a diversified portfolio of species than the inland First Nations do.
How much of the commercial Fraser sockeye fishery is the department hoping to have harvested in river as opposed to in marine and approach areas moving forward?
I'm afraid I can't speak to the proportionality of the total commercial catch that would be fished in an inland fishery, but I can speak to the point that the majority of the PIC fee resources, about $100 million over 5 years, the majority of the resources identified for purchasing or quote-unquote purchasing, relinquishing access in the salmon fishery is for the terminal fisheries
When you
to
say
provide for that catch.
when you say you can't speak to the proportion of the fishery that the department will move in river through processes like ATP and pick fee, is that because there isn't a plan that articulates that, or is it for some other reason?
I'm not personally aware of the proportion that it would end up resulting in. I really am not a salmon expert, so I can't speak to the way that the calculations are made with respect to coastal catches vis-a-vis inland catches.
As the director of pick fee,
Yes.
thank you.
Karina McGivney wanted to ask.
Yes, I'll come to you in just a minute, Ms. McGivney. I just want to follow up with Ms. Stewart. As the director of pick fee, had a decision been made about the proportion that the department was seeking to have moved, would you not be aware of it?
I can speak to the amount of pick fee resources that are being, as I said, that are being applied to relinquishments to allow for that inland fishery.
Thank you. Ms. McGivney, you had a...
I just wanted to
weigh in
add,
on this, thank you.
I just wanted to add, to my knowledge, there's no specific plan of how much fish would be moved to inland harvest versus marine harvest. Those are things that would come through negotiation, and then the long-term sort of moving towards a share-based fishery, how things would be managed would be worked out over time.
With respect to salmon licenses or salmon quota obtained through pick fee or ATP buybacks, all of the pick fee licenses and most of the ATP licenses are being used, that have been acquired, are being used to support in-river salmon fishery. Is that correct?
To this point in time, yes.
Excuse me, may I add?
Yes, sir.
Certainly, ATP has been a long-term program, and there are many salmon licenses that are out distributed to First Nations and marine areas that are currently there. I think Ms. Stewart was referring to sort of the more recent acquisitions under ATP.
Can we please have our tab 40 on the screen? This is an email from Angela Bate, and she worked under you on pick fee. Is that right, Ms. Stewart?
She doesn't report directly to me. She's a colleague of mine who is responsible for implementation of pick fee here in Vancouver.
Okay. Did she report to you, Ms. McGivney?
No, she's my colleague.
Okay. She's writing an email to Brenda McCorkdale, who at the time was the executive director of the First Nations Fishery Council, copied to you, Ms. McGivney. The first line of the email says, all of the pick fee licenses and most of the ATP are being used to support in-river demonstration fisheries. Can either of you confirm whether that's an accurate statement?
I think this was with regards to implementing short-term use of existing licenses that had not been yet allocated. So through pick fee, there had been licenses acquired and not allocated because of the process of coming through to the business planning. There were some ATP licenses also that had not yet been distributed, and it's those that are being referred to in this for a short-term allocation for 2010.
To be clear, the pick fee salmon licenses that have been acquired are being used to support in-river fisheries as opposed to marine fisheries, correct?
Yes.
Could I just add to that?
Please.
That we're still in the process of relinquishing licenses, and that will continue through this fiscal year.
Thank you. Ms. McGivney, I wonder if you can just explain to the Commissioner the process which one goes through to acquire a license and then redistribute the allocation. Because of course the quota that's obtained through the purchase of a license consists of a number of different stocks, and I take it one can't just acquire a license for 100 fish and then redistribute that to a single terminal area.
It is a complex process because of the stocks that are available in one fishing area versus the stocks that are available in another. basically, because we don't have, haven't implemented a fully share-based fishery for salmon yet, in terms of moving these fish into the inland demonstration fisheries, the process that's undertaken is to look at the relative proportions of the different stocks that would be harvested in the license that's being acquired, whether it be in Johnson Strait or the lower river. Look at the relative proportion of those stocks and then apply those to where they're being caught in the river. For instance, if there was a stock for the upper Fraser River is only 20% of the harvest in the marine fishery, if that license is acquired, only 20% of that upper river stock would be allocated for a demonstration fishery upriver.
Thank you. Just before we move on, if I could have that last document marked as the next exhibit, please.
Exhibit 1422.
So if you said to the commissioner, if 20% of the stock that was covered by a license was from a particular terminal area, the equivalent of that 20% could be reallocated to a particular terminal area where it was heading. Is that?
Yeah, I meant to say 20%
Yes.
of the harvest.
Yes.
If that stock is 20% of the harvest of that license, then that's the amount of harvest that would be reallocated up into another fishery.
How does that sort of approach take into account the fact that a number of the fish that would have been caught on the marine areas won't make it to any terminal area because they will die as a result of en route mortality?
My understanding is it's not calculated into that element now, but the management of the Fraser sockeye does take into account a management adjustment factor in terms of being able to plan for fisheries that happen further down the gauntlet to meeting the objectives upriver. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty in estimates throughout the system, and so for escapement purposes, that management account is taken into account. Currently, for the level of the fisheries, it likely falls within the error uncertainty estimates within the management right now.
So at present, there's not an additional en route mortality adjustment that's applied when the allocation is moved from marine to a terminal fishery.
Correct.
As more and more of the fishery is moved into the river, if one does take into account the fact that a number of the fish will terminate en route, will it result in less fish being available to be harvested in the commercial fishery generally?
So your question is less fish available in which fishery?
The combined commercial fishery, both communal in-river commercial fishery and, well, let me put it this way. If there's 100 fish available for harvest in the commercial fishery and those 100 fish are now going to be harvested in the terminal areas, some of those 100 fish will die en route, and there will be some number less than 100 available to be caught close to the terminal areas. Is that correct?
That's possible. I think the other element that needs to be considered is that those fisheries will still be subject to the same rules that we have throughout. If the fish don't show up, then there won't be the harvest.
Has the department determined whether there will be, whether the commercial catch, and maybe Ms. Stewart, you can answer this, have they considered whether the approach they're taking through PICFI to move fisheries into the river will result in the long term, once a sufficient proportion of the fisheries moved in river, will it result in less fish being available to be caught commercially?
I think it's very important in this conversation to keep in mind that we manage salmon fisheries to ensure the conservation of weak stocks. So in coastal fisheries, often there isn't an opportunity to fish because weak stocks are mixing with strong stocks in any event. So that will impact on the whole consideration of how many fish get to a terminus in any event.
Yes. But the excess that get to terminal areas in any event, because of precautionary fishing approaches lower down, are already available to be harvested through the excess sockeye to spawner recruit requirements. ESSR, is that correct?
The point being that coastal fisheries have to take into account that there are weak stocks mixing with the stronger stocks, and so opportunities to fish that might have been available, might not be available because of that mixing of the weaker stocks with the stronger stocks.
What's the department's intention with respect to the priority to be applied to in-river commercial fisheries as compared to conventional commercial fisheries?
The priority for commercial fisheries, no matter where they're located, would be the same.
And
An
is
integrated
it,
fishery.
thank you, is it still the intention of the department that commercial fisheries, regardless of where they occur, ought to operate on common rules for all or comparable rules for all?
Yes.
At present, in the conventional commercial fishery, there are a number of expenses borne by fishers, such as the increased cost of some of the increased costs of monitoring and quota fisheries. The communal commercial fisheries in river, such matters as catch monitoring are borne by the department. Is the department's intention to move towards fisheries which support themselves on an equivalent level moving forward, commercial fisheries?
Right now we're in the startup phase for commercial fisheries enterprises, particularly in the inland fisheries where we haven't had commercial fisheries before. It wouldn't make sense for the department to provide access for commercial fisheries in those startup phases without providing some support for some of the catch monitoring and other elements that go on around them. The future plans for the department are something that needs to be worked out, and those issues around costs and of monitoring, etc., are an issue that needs to be addressed.
Is it the department's intention that moving forward any commercial fisheries that operate in river will transition to being self-sustaining and covering the usual costs associated with the fishery as a commercial operation?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Is it the department's intention moving forward after the expiry of PIC fee that commercial fisheries operating in river will operate like commercial operations, funding the usual expenses associated with that from their profit?
With the end of PIC fee, of course, the resources that are available would cease. There are some options that are being explored going forward, and those cover a range from potentially a new program to no program or absorption within the department. There's a number of options out there that are being explored, but I can't speak to what the future will hold.
Demonstration fisheries was so the department could assess the viability of them. Is that fair?
Yes.
And has the department done an assessment of the economic viability of in-river fisheries as they're presently being operated?
Again, there hasn't been a whole lot of experience gained so far. We had a couple of years during the PIC fee, the period that PIC fee has been in place, where there were very limited commercial opportunities in those terminal fisheries. So the ability to sort of assess viability has been somewhat limited, but the First Nations have done some very important work in that regard, and are working very closely with DFO colleagues in the BC Interior region on assessing them.
PIC fee is, yes. Please.
I was just going to add that the department did do a study, which I was actually involved in back in 1993, which was looking at one component of economic viability, and that was the quality of the fish harvested at the time. So I just wanted to add that in that the department has done some work in the past.
And the conclusion from that study?
The conclusions that I recall, it was a while ago, but that there was evidence that the quality of the fish in areas could be would support a canned product, as well as some specialty products of smoking and roe and things like that. And so there was further work. It was a very preliminary study, but part of what I think we are testing through the PIC fee demonstration fisheries are more in depth in terms of quality and some of the marketability and the technical elements of that would be required to make an assessment of whether it's economically viable.
I was just going to say, just for the record, Mr. Commissioner, I believe that that document that you just referred to, Ms. McGivney just referred to, is on the First Nations Coalition list of documents number 123, and I assume perhaps you'll get to it at some point.
I'm happy to have it brought up right now, and I'm happy to enter it as an exhibit. I think that would be appropriate. It is an
It's not yet an exhibit, Mr. Commissioner. It's tab 123 of our list.
Perhaps it would be appropriate to mark it as the next exhibit, Mr. Commissioner.
You'll see, Ms. McGivney, I've got a cover sheet on it, and then your report is attached to it to the cover sheet.
It'll be marked as Exhibit 1423.
And for the record, this is a report titled Terminal Fisheries for Lake Stewart Horsefly Sockeye Quality and Financial Viability, and you're one of the authors of the report.
Yes.
And that's the, if you, I think your microphone is on.
Sorry, yes.
And this is a report prepared in 1990. The draft here is a 1994 document, which did some preliminary work looking at the commercial viability of the product.
Yes.
And the conclusions that you came to are set out in the body of the report.
Yes.
And you characterize this as preliminary work. Subsequent to 1994, has the department continued work in this area prior to commencing the PICFI program?
Not that I recall, or that I'm aware of.
Prior to making a determination to spend many millions of dollars purchasing licenses to support in-river fisheries, did the department not do any further investigations as to the commercial viability of the product that was available, or the commercial viability of small inland fisheries?
I can't recall specific, but I believe there was some work with some of the First Nations in terms of looking at this through some of our other programming, but I just am not recalling the specifics.
Mr. Rosenberger was asked some questions about this one. Oh, yeah, certainly, if that hasn't been marked. The next exhibit, please.
1424.
And Mr. Rosenberger made reference to an analysis that had been done of a fishery conducted by the Okanagan Nation Alliance. Are you familiar with that report? Yeah, you're nodding.
Yes, I've heard of it.
And just to be clear, these are not Fraser River fish, nor are they sockeye, correct? That were harvested in this fishery?
Those are Columbia River runs going into a Soyuz lake.
We could go, please, to page 18 of this document. And I take it back, they are sockeye, pardon me, but they're not Fraser River sockeye. I'm at report at our page, tab 59. Maybe just start at the first page so the commissioner can see the cover page. This is prepared for PICFI by the Okanagan Nation Alliance. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I just thought we ought to, now that Canada has provided us with the report after Mr. Rosenberger's testimony, or alerted us to it, I thought it would be appropriate to enter it. If we just, while we're doing that, if we turn to page 18, the document, page 18.
Thank you.
If we look at the gross margin, the very bottom line of this page, let's enlarge the chart. There are 4 different fisheries that appear to have taken place: a seine in the Soyuz, a troll in the Soyuz, a gill net in the river, and a gill net in the Soyuz. And as I read this, I read each of those fisheries coming up at a loss, ranging from $300 some odd to over $16,000. Has the department taken any steps to address this situation? Have they made a determination whether fisheries that result in losses like this will be continued to be supported moving forward after the expiry of PICFI?
I think there's a couple of considerations at play here. Number one, as I said, it's very early days. There have really not been very many opportunities for the Okanagan Nation Alliance to have commercial fisheries. They're doing a lot of work on marketing and developing of markets. So I suggest that those numbers reflect the fact that this is very early days in a startup operation. And would also suggest that that's probably in line with most lines of business, whether it be a fishery or any other kind of business, that the startup phase is not necessarily the most profitable.
This report could be the next exhibit, please.
1,424.
We turn to our next tab, please, tab 60. This moves us into the Fraser River fishery. And this was a report on Near Terminal Commercial Fisheries Development Program 2007. It appears to have been created by the Secwepemc, thank you, Fisheries Commission. And the subsequent to Mr. Rosenberger testifying, the department has alerted us to this document. So I'll perhaps just show it to you and enter it as an exhibit. If we go to page 23, please, it's the portion where they do the assessment of profitability starts, and that's document page 23.
Thank you.
The bottom of the page there, potential profitability was assessed for only 2 fisheries that were successful in catching fish. And if we flip over the page, it looks like they actually assessed profitability for 2 fisheries in 1 fish market. So starting with the Kamloops gillnet fishery, the result of this assessment, the average catch of 15 Chinook per night in Kamloops Lake gillnet fishery was not sufficient for the fishery to be profitable, regardless of how long it operated. The fixed cost was $300 and the variable cost was $900 per night. Is this a report you're familiar with?
Yes.
So that's 100, and if I read it over 10 days, 150 fish costing a little bit north of $9,000 to catch?
Yes.
Okay. Looking at the, and to be clear, these were not sockeye, they were Chinook. Moving next to the assessment of the Thompson River Lake Beach Seine fishery, starting at the second sentence, neither the female pink catch nor the Chinook catch alone were sufficient for the fishery to be profitable. However, the catch of both species taken together allowed the fishery to be potentially profitable by the second day of operations. And you're familiar with that conclusion?
Yes.
And moving to the profitability of the fish market on the next page, you'll see the chart there, and if we just flip over one page to the top of page 26, we'll have the conclusion. Only 104 pounds of product was sold per day at an average price of $2.69 per pound. At these sales levels, the fish market could never approach profitability. So my question is, given some might argue were at least not immediately successful results within river fisheries, what sort of analysis has the department done about whether or not the growing number of in-river fisheries could potentially be profitable? Is there a document that sets out an analysis of whether of what the department has determined in that regard?
I'm not aware of any document that's been written that sort of assesses these results. Again, I would say that we're in early days of these fisheries, and it does take some exploration. There hasn't been a commercial fishery in any of these areas before, so there's some exploration around what kind of product is most marketable, and not necessarily just a flush market, but also the roe or dried product, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of exploration that's happening just to test out where the market could go and could grow. There would also be a lot of potential streamlining that could take place, or improvements in the way that production takes place to narrow that margin.
You say that none of these commercial fisheries were taking place previously. In-river commercial fisheries through pilot sales and economic opportunity fisheries have been occurring since 1992, is that right?
Those are in the area where the river is quite broad, and there are gillnet fleets in that area as well. The Okanagan fishery and the Secwepemc fishery, and up in the middle and upper reaches of the Fraser, have not had commercial salmon fisheries. And so the fishery is quite different in comparison to a food, social, and ceremonial fishery. It has to be conducted in a different way. So those explorations are happening now.
The fisheries you were referring to in the wider part of the river they were authorized sales fisheries and have been taking place since the early 90s, correct?
Yes, with the Stolo, Musqueam, Tawasin First Nations.
You say that these fisheries are
Mr. Commissioner, I'm not sure if you're going on to another topic or not, but this is a report that's been completed by my client, and I need to stand up so the record is clear. In both of the previous questions, when Commission Counsel took the witnesses to the profitability of the fisheries, he failed to read the remaining paragraph, the remaining sentences in the same paragraph that reflect when break-even points are found and the observations on that. And so I think for the record, I think it's important that the two sentences following the sentence that was written. So on page 24, he read the first two sentences. Below the graph, it reflects, however, the production rate could be raised to an average of, and it continues. And then on the second reference, when he goes to page 26, he read the first sentence, but in the second sentence, however, he doesn't read the next sentence, which refers to a break-even point even at that point in time and the observations that are made. And I think for the record, at least that should be reflected.
Certainly, I'm happy to cover that. If we turn back to page 26 of the document. The fish market that was conducted was able to sell 104 pounds at $2.69 per pound. You see that?
Yes.
The next paragraph goes on to break even. That would potentially be reached after 8 days of sales. If the sales per day could be tripled, and the sales price increased from $2.69 to $4 a pound. That was the conclusion, correct?
Yes.
And if we turn back to the Kamloops gillnet fishery, which operated for 10 nights, with a $900 a night cost, catching 150 fish. If we go down below the chart, we see the conclusion, however, the production rate could be raised to an average of 20 Chinook per night. The fishery could potentially break even by the 5th night. Alternatively, the price per pound could be raised to $4 per pound. The fishery could break even in 5 nights. That's the conclusion as to what would need to happen in order for these fisheries to break even those changes.
According to this report, yes.
That could be the next exhibit, please.
1,425.
Now, Ms. Stewart, you said that you were in the early days, but PICFI is set to expire shortly, and do I take it there's no guarantee of any continuing funds to support these fisheries?
That's right.
What plan does the department have in place to work with these First Nations on these fisheries to continue to ensure improvements so that they will be commercially viable operations, or alternatively to support them if they're not self-sustaining?
We're doing work now, some analyses that we're providing to senior management, and decisions will be made on the future programming that might be available or what the options might be.
What's the anticipated timeline?
Well, certainly before the end of PICFI.
Has that work commenced?
Yes.
Have there been any preliminary conclusions as to what the department's intentions are with respect to continuing to grow in-river commercial fisheries?
There's work ongoing, and those discussions haven't been concluded, and I can't
Has the
speak to
department come to any preliminary conclusion as to whether it can, from a financial perspective, continue to support these fisheries without funds from PICFI?
Again, that's discussions that are happening at senior management levels.
Have you been part of those discussions?
Some of them, yes.
Leaving aside the discussion, as the director of PICFI has been involved for the last 5 years, what conclusions have you come to as to whether the department can continue to fund and support these in-river fisheries without the continuation of PICFI?
Certainly there would be challenges. As you can see, there are definitely investments that have to be made on an ongoing basis in both conducting the fisheries and doing the research that the ONA and the Schwetmec reports have enunciated.
PICFI in its long form is Pacific Integrated Commercial Fisheries Initiative. What does the word integrated refer to?
With respect to commercial fisheries, one of the objectives of PICFI is that commercial fisheries that are carried out by First Nations and by non-Aboriginal people be integrated so that they're conducted following common and transparent rules. I'll leave it at that.
What's the department's position on whether the increasing in-river fisheries, let me ask you this, is it the department's intention to make them available to First Nations only, or is it the department's intention to create in-river fishing opportunities, commercial opportunities for non-First Nation organizations or individuals, or has a decision been made?
No decision has been made.
Has the department turned its mind to that issue?
In this current PICFI initiative, that was not something that was contemplated.
Is one of the challenges faced by First Nations attempting to operate in-river commercial operations the number of fish that have been making it upriver in a number of the recent years?
McGowan, I wonder if you could use the microphone.
Certainly, I apologize. Is one of the challenges faced by First Nations attempting to operate commercial fisheries in-river the number of fish that have been making their way upriver in recent years?
Well, I would suggest that that's probably a challenge for all salmon fisheries, but with respect to interior fisheries, that's definitely an issue as fish go in their migratory patterns to the various terminus. Those that are available to be harvested in, as you go up the system, sort of get fewer as you go up. So the outcome of that, I guess, in terms of the fisheries that are happening in those areas, is finding the right mix of products to be provided to the market and identifying markets, and all of the things that have been enunciated in these two reports that you've referred to are the kind of considerations that the First Nations are undergoing with respect to those fisheries, because it is different from the coastal fisheries.
I'm going to turn now, Ms. McGivney, to ask you some questions about the Aboriginal Fisheries Framework. If we could have our tab 38 brought up on the screen, please.
Mr. McGowan, I don't mean to interrupt, but I don't know when you want to take the break. If this is a short set of questions, we can continue on. If you're going to be longer, we could take the break now.
I'm content to take the break now, Mr. Commissioner.
Hearing will now recess for 15 minutes.